Welcome to 10 Cent Opinions. My name is Noah, or Argo, depending on who you ask, and like many others, I'm constantly surrounded by pop culture. However, I've never been satisfied with the modern state of the arts, for even with the sheer amount of media, there is still a significant lack in the quality of our creations. This problem is only amplified by the lack of knowledge surrounding what makes something good. Thus, in an effort to answer this question, my friends and I have endeavored to create a podcast that could discuss art and pop culture intellectually, without ever dipping into the theoretical side of art that these discussions so often fall prey to. So, if I were to explain it in one sentence, then, the purpose of 10 Cent Opinions is to discuss well crafted media and thereby understand what makes something well crafted, or good. In this episode, we discuss the action adventure genre at large, where it is now, where it was, and where it's going. You see, action adventure games dominated the early consoles because their flexible nature allowed them to be molded into whatever the programmers wanted. Soon, however, they would go on to form the backbone of the gaming landscape. As we fast forward into the future, their effects on the media of gaming is all too present, from the smallest indie title to the next AAA blockbuster. Every game in some form has taken inspiration from this genre. Thus, in understanding the action adventure genre, you gain a larger understanding of games as a whole. So, without further ado, here is the first episode of 10 Cent. Ten Cent Opinions. Today we'll be talking about the action adventure genre and what makes a good game in said genre. I'm Noah. Here we have.
I'm Xander.
Yeah, darn it. And my name's Colton.
Did you forget your name?
No, but I talked and then you talked and then it was just kind of awkward.
Yeah, I feel you.
Now, you guys have both played lots of games, right? And probably a game genre that everybody interacts with at some point is the action adventure genre. It's kind of the middle ground between all the other ones. It's a very flat genre where you can make a lot of different things out of, and so it has a lot of room for creativity. But that begs the question, how do you define the game? So what would you guys say makes an action adventure game?
Well, I think the first thing that makes a good action adventure game is typically the gameplay. People will buy action adventure games purely solely based on the gameplay, right? That's the core of a game. So, say Batman Arkham Knight, which revolutionized a kind of beat 'em up style that a lot of games have now, like Shadow of Mordor and both the Spider-Man games, as well as with each and every action adventure game, it seems like they're focusing more and more on gameplay than they are on story in recent times, and I can get more into that later.
Okay. Yeah, I should probably come back to that, but Colton, how would you define an action adventure game?
I would say it serves as...
Go on.
I'd say it serves as more of a foundation for a lot of different game genres that we are used to nowadays. Sort of like RPGs, open world games, things like that, is all based off of an adventure and an action-based, combat-based adventure game. And on what Xander was saying, a lot of it, like what makes a good one, is, in my opinion, gameplay and animation, especially. Like a very smooth combat system really plays into being satisfying to play and kill things, because that's what gaming is.
Sure. A good combat system certainly works.
I mean, like, even I was playing the yesterday, and like at first, one of my issues was that the combat just felt really slow at the beginning, and I realized now. Chronicles 2.
Say that again.
Blade Chronicles 2.
Gotcha. You cut out for a moment.
If you're so jealous of me, of Noah.
I really do want
Um,
to play it. So the combat
my
was good.
issue was that it felt really slow at the beginning, and that's because you don't have any control of what your character's doing beyond where you're standing. But then, as I sort of got out of that tutorial area and I had access to a lot more special abilities, things like that, the complexity of the game, even though it was slow, was still satisfying to play.
All right. So
Okay.
those are some nice nuggets, bro. Um.
I just uploaded chicken strips to the chat.
So what would you say are the pinnacle of action adventure genre? With the main games that everybody looks to? And do you think they have that type of combat?
I think the greatest action adventure slash stealth to genre series, at least in my opinion, is the Metal Gear Solid series or the Metal Gear series in general. Not only does it have fun gameplay that held its own over so many years, at least the remasters. I'm not going to speak for the originals because I haven't actually played them, but it also has an encapsulating story, which is what that's what made me stay, and that's what made me want to care so much about the other games because I love the characters so much. I love the story. Same general idea with Batman Arkham Asylum and the Asylum series or the Arkham series is that they have all these really interesting characters that kind of brighten up the game because you have Batman who's really dark. He can get kind of boring sometimes, but all of the villains and the characters that he faces are so characteristic. I feel like having good characters and good story is if you want a series, if you want to make a series out of it, I think that's super important. If you want people to buy your game, then sure, just add in good gameplay. But
So the Zelda series, right? We would probably all agree that started the action adventure genre. It doesn't have the best characters, although some people may disagree with me saying they're very memorable and such. Do you think why do you think that game's so popular even though it's just the same story?
well, they do something that not a lot of other franchises or series do, and that's they change it pretty much every single game. It started with the Legend of Zelda 2, where the format was completely changed. Of course, that was the second game that came out on the NES. The format was completely changed from the first one. It was still an action adventure per se, but what they've been doing this entire time is they've been keeping people's interest in the game. I feel like even though Breath of Wild is so incredibly successful for Nintendo, I can almost guarantee you that next time they're going to go in a different direction.
That's an interesting because I was going to get to that question later. Because Breath of the Wild was so popular, how would it affect this genre? But I guess we could get back to that later. Something else you
One
may
thing that
go
one
on.
thing I would like to add to Xander's thought is that does make a lot of sense. If you think about a like Pokemon game, for example, whenever you when somebody asks you if you're going to play the new Pokemon game, the only reason you have to do so is if you just absolutely love the series. But if you play a game and you get the idea, then there is no reason for you to pick up the new game. And that's why a lot of times, if you have a diehard Nintendo fan, it makes a lot more sense for them to miss a Pokemon game for them to miss a Zelda game because it's all the same.
That's
I
true.
have not bought a Pokemon game in like 5 years because of that sole reason, actually. So, there
Because
you go.
they're just the
Why
same.
actually? I haven't played it since the remake for Ruby.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, I did buy. I guess I'm more of a Pokemon fan than you guys because I stopped playing around. I bought every game up to the Hawaiian one, Sun and Moon, and then I'll probably buy the one that comes out on the Switch. Because I have my fingers crossed that they'll actually reinvent the system to work better on the Switch. But that brings up another question: would you consider Pokemon an action adventure game, or does it lean more towards, say, strictly RPG?
I would say it's a strategy adventure game. It's not There's not much action to
Yeah,
it, but
Okay,
I
strategy
have to
adventure.
agree with Colton a little bit more there. I feel like action adventure is kind of this big. It's a whole genre of games, and then every single game that is counted as an action adventure game gets kind of its own subgenre. I feel like Pokemon is almost like its very own subgenre. It's not quite pure RPG like the Final Fantasy series, but it's also not,
Yeah,
like Batman Arkham Asylum.
that's something that's unique to this genre is that it's more of the cake itself, and then there are so many different types of frostings and flavors that get added onto it. Like I was looking on Steam a while ago, sometime earlier this day, to see what they categorize as action adventure, and every game that was listed is so different from one another that it almost makes you wonder what it makes an action adventure game if it's just not.
Hey, don't forget the Barbie Dreamhouse games. Those count too.
Dude, that's my favorite.
That's a puzzle game right there. Don't you lie to me.
Check the tags on Steam for Barbie Dreamhouse. I'm pretty sure one of them says murder.
It's a horror game.
Check. I'll be right back.
I was about to go check that actually. Yeah.
All right. Well,
It's on our computers. It's all right.
so earlier on, Xander said that gameplay makes a good action adventure game, or was that you, Colton? Or I guess you both kind of said it. But
Yeah.
so, what goes into good gameplay? For me, I think taking Breath of the Wild for an example. A bunch of people complained about how the weapons broke very easily, but I think that just gave you more of an incentive to explore and fight because you knew you were going to get more weapons, and it gave you more of a reason to think outside the box in combating your foes. You start to take into account the terrain. So here in Breath of the Wild, the space of the world turns into a puzzle for you to solve. It's more of just X and B or whatever. In addition, it wasn't like normal Zelda games where you just have one attack. You have the parry, the dodge, the different weapons had different attacks, and then you had your charging one, like your spin attack. Those little differences also helped give you more options to solve puzzles in that space. So, in my opinion, that's what makes a good combat encounter is something that allows freedom to solve a puzzle, not just press buttons.
Interesting.
Right. I love the idea of an open world where the world is your puzzle, and where you just run left and right and something happens. That's a problem with the Metal Gear series or the new Metal Gear game 5 is that it's very objective. You go from one place to the other. There's not much happening in between. I mean, there are a couple missions that come out of nowhere, but you get my gist. Is that I think, however, the action adventure does not have to be strictly open world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Can you do you have any examples of that? I can think of one, but I want to see if you can come up with something.
Well, I know I keep saying Metal Gear, but even though they are kind of open world-ish, the older games are more level-based.
Yeah.
Than open world. So I guess that's one way is that you notice that there's a lot of level-based action adventure games. There aren't very. I can't think of any super linear action adventure games where you don't have a choice of what to do or where to go. I guess that's something that's really unique. Is that you have the freedom of choice. So much more in action adventure games than in most other games. In puzzle games, there's one objective. You're going to that objective, and there's usually one or two ways to get there. And fighting games, your objective is beat your opponent. But in action adventure games, you have so many different choices, which has gone completely off of my original point.
Well, you did make me think of something. It wouldn't be much of an adventure if you don't have some level of agency in your actions or in the way you interact with the world. So, And this probably has to do with how the original action adventure was the first Zelda, or the adventure game. And so it was about you finding your own path. But every game thereafter had to. It emphasizes this feeling of agency in your own journey.
One thing that we've talked about before, Noah, which was frustrating, was whether or not Wind Waker could be considered an open world game, and especially if it had that linear structure to it, which is a discussion for another day. But I think that even if you don't have linear structure, you can still have that operate within an open world game, which I think comes in the way of or like a side quest or something like that.
Well, yeah, like if you go look at the indie titles that came out that I would consider action adventure, like Hyper Light Drifter, Tunic, which is coming out next year, and that Abzu game. Not the one about swimming, but the one where you turn into a bird and you fly it around. Although that didn't have any action, so maybe you can take that one or leave it. But those all operate in a defined world that only has a certain number of paths, but in those paths you have smaller deviations and variations of the larger world. So it's not totally open world like you would find in Grand Theft Auto, Breath of the Wild, Minecraft, but it is still giving you some level of agency in your journey. Makes sense?
I got you. I was waiting for Xander to add something.
So, but that is something I've noticed recently. Back to the indie idea, is that they
Yeah.
seem to be carrying the torch of true action adventure games in the vein of the old Zeldas, but with a modern flair.
That's the question: is how do we define true if we can't define what it actually is, given how wide of a genre it is?
I would say an action adventure game is any game that's broken into an overworld and an underworld, preferably where the overworld is semi-open and the underworld tends to have enemies in it and puzzles. It's still a very flexible definition, but that's how I would go about doing it.
I agree.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that.
But then if you compare that to games, like let's take Shadow of the Colossus. I'm not sure if Shadow of the Colossus would fit into that category. Although I guess you could say that instead of underworlds, they're just designated areas with monsters in them with combat encounters.
Yeah, I would say that. Like a physical underground or underworld area, it's actually just two aspects of the game, one being the combat sections, the other being the exploring the vast world.
Yeah, vast in quotations.
That's the game it was awesome because even though it wasn't necessarily a huge map, it felt huge because there was nothing.
In Shadow of the
Good
Colossus?
way. Yeah, like there's no NPCs. There's barely any music. But the thing is that it doesn't feel empty. It just feels grand.
Atmospheric.
Which is an I don't fear it.
How do you think that the game gives the world that feels scale? Because it was clearly intended to do that. You can feel that when you fight the Titans. The other aspect.
Pans back away from your actual horse, and it does a sort of like sweeping pan of what's around you.
You know, that's kind of interesting because think about the Attack on Titan game, which you know, even though Titans are supposed to be huge and they don't do as good of a job at capturing the scale.
Interesting.
I think
go on.
Oh, I think it has a lot to do with the atmosphere. of the game. I think that's important. I think one of the most important things beyond gameplay is the map, the location that you're having the game in, and that's something that's done nothing but improve over the past few years. I mean, if you go back in time, look at Grand Theft Auto 3. It's such a bland and barren world. And then you look at even the newest Grand Theft Auto, and it's absolutely staggeringly different just in a period of a few years. I feel like we're able to create worlds that feel more real and more immersive. And I feel like that's what Shadow of the Colossus did really well, is that even though there wasn't much to do, it was incredibly immersive in what it did do, if you catch my drift.
Yeah. And that's the role of the designer and the crew. Actually, let me pose a question. It will be off topic, but I watched a video where this guy was saying that the purpose of games is to immerse the player. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily the purpose, but it plays a huge role into how we perceive the games. Because in essence, we could get into the definition of art, which would just be a whole different thing. But the purpose of really is just to give the player an enjoyable experience. However you go about doing that is up to you. But one means of doing that would be immersing them within your world, and getting them emotionally in the sort of the story or anything like that.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with Colton in that I feel like there are a lot of people who play games and they don't want to be immersed, which, there are, of course, the phone gamers who are people who play games on their phone. Of course, you can't really call phone gaming immersive, especially after you've experienced gaming on the big screen. At least from my personal experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think the purpose of games is necessarily to immerse the player, but I do think it is a tool in the game designer's tool belt to help create the experience that they want to.
I feel like if you want to make a good game that's going to last and that people are going to remember, you have to do a good job at immersing the player, though. I mean, I feel like that should be a prerequisite for getting any Game of the Year award or any award, unless there's an award for at least immersive game, in which to each their own.
That wouldn't really be an award, though.
Anything can be an award.
Fair enough.
I think there is an award show in Hollywood. Don't quote me on this, but I think that does the worst awards, like the worst film of the year.
Yeah, they're called the Razzies.
Oh, all right then.
So, back on the topic of action adventure games, and this would be purely speculation, but where do you think the action adventure genre will be in 3 to 5 years, taking into account Breath of the Wild and the amount of indie devs who are creating their own versions of what I consider to be the Zelda formula and the OG action adventure formula?
Original games. In my opinion, I think we're going to have a lot of very different titles. And we're not going to have that sort of cookie cutter example of what a action adventure game is or an RPG is. It's all going to start changing. The new Monster Hunter World that they were talking about at PAX, like they're taking that franchise and taking it in a whole completely different direction. And I think that's because of Breath of the Wild. And then also the indie titles with colorful images and interesting concepts, things like that, are really gonna come out from the woodworks.
I agree with Colton, but I feel like games are gonna probably take on the more Barbie Dreamhouse Adventure series.
That's what we really want, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, go ahead.
Want the gaming franchise to be in 5 years, definitely.
I agree.
More
but,
shovelware.
In all seriousness, I feel like every few years there's a game that comes and changes everything. I feel like Breath of the Wild, it's changed a lot, but I feel like there is a developer of a game, and he's most likely going to be an independent developer. And I feel like he's working on a new formula that's probably going to revolutionize the action adventure game series once again. I mean, you're going to see lots of things whenever a new action adventure game comes out like that, where it changes everything. You see a lot of people that are going to start copying aspects from the game and making their own, i.e., of course, the Batman series, which it sounds like I only quote 2 games.
Or the original Halo.
Right, or the original Halo, you're right. And that people see it's a good formula, so they'll start using that. And of course, it works. I mean, even look at the Call of Duty Modern Warfare Battlefield-esque games. You know, they started developing games like that. Now they're more just pure action first-person shooter games. But once you have a formula that people like, they're gonna start copying it, and they're gonna start changing it, and making it their own, which I think is really cool. But also, there are some games where it gets to a point that it's just unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. You're not adding anything to the sea of games. There's a quote by Hayao Miyazaki where he says, pouring water onto a flood. He says, I'm pouring water onto a flood, but even in a flood, you still need to drink good water. So he was talking about animation at the time, but it applies to most media. And I think...
I agree.
Actually, let me take a step back. Back to, you were saying that somebody will come along and revolutionize this genre. But the thing about Breath of the Wild, which made it revolutionary, was because the genre had become stagnant and because the Zelda games, mechanically and thematically, were the same. There was nothing new, and they kind of talked down to the player. It's so good because it is the ideal action-adventure game where it wants the player to have an adventure. And so it's funny to start thinking about where the genre will go, because it's, in my opinion, the only where I don't think mechanically it can improve very much, but I think thematically and the types of adventures you can have are going to change. And then maybe the mechanics will change slightly along with those to accommodate the type of adventures. But I don't think the core element of what makes Breath of the Wild good will ever go away, or at least not for a long time.
I tend to agree. I feel like one thing that Breath of the Wild does extremely well is that it does not hold your hand.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many games that give you difficulty options and games that are easy from the get-go and that you just kind of get and you play them. Of course, you have fun, but what Breath of the Wild does well is it gives you this sense of risk. You know what I'm saying? The kind of risk that people who always play on the hardest difficulty crave. It's the what will happen next and how will I get through this thing, and
there's a weight to your actions.
More immersive. It makes it feel more real almost, in that you don't have an easy way out, in that you don't have an obvious answer as long as you don't use the internet. In that you have to figure it out yourself, in that there is no hand holding, which I think the game did incredibly well. That's something that the Dark Souls series has been praised for, which I'm not going to compare any game to Dark Souls. That's been done too much. But
it's even created its own genre now.
Right.
I mean, people comparing to it is now a genre into itself, which is a little funny. Actually, would you consider Dark Souls an action-adventure game? I would.
I would.
Yes.
That's another game that's revolutionized the landscape of gaming. But you were going to say something, Colton?
With the addition of you played it, right, Xander?
Which game? Dark Souls?
Breath of the Wild.
Yes, I played Breath of the Wild.
On the first plateau area, whenever you're down by the lake in that forest clearing, and you walk up on these rocks and then it starts shifting below you, and you have the first realization there's a monster, you're about to fight a boss sort of thing. There's no preparation for that. You don't walk in there, a health bar doesn't pop up, all of a sudden there's just a monster there and you got to deal with it. And you got to problem solve doing that by, look, that's probably a weak point on his back, I can probably hit that. And it really just shows that it doesn't hold your hand, it doesn't expect you, it doesn't try to teach you everything, you just kind of have to deal with what you got. And I like that.
I remember the red. What? Sorry, no, I'll let you talk in just a second.
I wasn't going to say anything. Although
okay.
we've passed 30 minutes, so we should start to wrap up. But go on.
I just want to add that I remember the first time that I fought the red named Lionel, and he killed me in one hit, and I got so pissed off that I sat there for 2 to 3 hours just memorizing all of his moves and figuring out how to kill him. I remember I killed him with the last strike on my last weapon that I had. I used all of my weapons. And, I feel like games that don't hold your hand can give you a kind of satisfaction that no other video game that has difficulty options can. I mean, beating a game on hard, I understand, but people typically tend to choose normal difficulty, which is still not that difficult, typically. But I think that's one thing that I feel like games should tend more towards, is actually making the player feel like they're rewarded.
Yeah. Rewarded, and justly so. Not like...
That's a big thing, is that you don't want to feel rewarded whenever you don't actually earn it. And another thing is that it doesn't necessarily have to happen through like an in-game reward or something like that. Just that satisfaction you get whenever you beat something. It doesn't matter what you get in the game, it's just that you know that you killed it. Ever beaten the game.
Yes and no. Yes, when it was like a personal goal, and no when it's actually a physical thing that they tell you to do, which is something that Breath of the Wild does well. You see a mountain, you're like, I want to climb up to the top of that mountain. You get up there, guess what? You get a Korok seed. It's a little something, but it's the game recognizing your drive to do what you want to do and not restricting you to what it wants you to do. In other games, I'm going to say Skyrim, but Skyrim was actually pretty good about this. Like, say you wanted to get to the top of the mountain. Well, guess what? You can't get up there. There's an invisible wall in your way. And so the game's punishing you for just wanting to explore its world. And that doesn't help anybody. That just makes the player frustrated, and it makes...
It's even worse in Skyrim, because it's not an invisible wall. It's just that the mountain is too steep. And so you spend like an hour walking around the mountain trying to find a way up there, and there's no way. And that's endlessly infuriating.
Yeah. So...
Well, if you read the quest description, it tells you which town to go to.
Oh, that brings up something.
Shut up, Xander.
But Xander just reminded me of something. That this applies to all open world games. Although the action adventure genre could really benefit from it, is having signs actually be in the world. Now that might sound weird, but in The Witcher you get like quests and you just follow the little dotted line, but there are no signs in the world and there's no actual direction. So if I wanted to turn off the little dotted line and actually explore the world myself, I couldn't ever find the quest I wanted to go to. But like in Breath of the Wild, if I'm standing at a crossroad and I got these two signs and I pick, I want to go to actually, let me take it back. In the first stable most people find, in that valley by Kakariko Village, you get a quest that tells you to find... It's something like... There's this hidden treasure behind a waterfall, but these NPCs give you a little...
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's like something about Big Brother, Little Sister, and then you go find Big Brother River and Little Sister River, and then you follow those rivers and you find a treasure. that little stuff where the player is figuring out the directions based on the world, not only makes the world feel more alive, but also rewards the player for exploration, and it's just fun, right? It's a little treasure hunt.
Yeah, like you get that information, and then you have to go pore over the map and the surrounding areas and find out where you're going. And that has an element of like you're an actual adventurer in this world, and you're trying to find where you're going.
Yeah. And to add on to that, Breath of the Wild, you can also turn off the map and then just completely use your own sense of direction and the signs you find in the world, which I always thought was cool.
But you're forced to do that before you have unveiled everything. Everything is blacked out.
Yeah, which also forces you to explore.
Right, finding all those towers. I mean, that's a goal in and of itself, is to just figure out the map.
All right, so we're kind of over time here, but just one last question.
Mm-hmm.
What did Breath of the Wild do wrong? We've kind of given it praise this whole time.
That's true. Just because I see it as a bit of a golden standard for action adventure, but something it did wrong is it could have had more bigger quests. Everything was very local and confined, but maybe something that had more like chains, like, oh, I found this, which leads me across the map to this, and then across the map to this. I guess it was Terrytown, but Terrytown to me was always kind of lame.
What did it do wrong? It didn't. Yeah, it was more like I got the quest. Now I just kind of it's like a sub quest where I'm just looking for a guy with the last name Sun.
Yeah, and there's no puzzle or riddle to it.
Yeah, one thing
really
that I actually
go ahead, Xander,
was not a huge fan of, which I know most people would probably disagree with me, was actually the gameplay itself was not as rewarding to me as gameplay in like The Witcher. I feel like it's more, to me, it feels like a little bit more button mashing than
I would agree with that.
In The Witcher, where you kind of have to stand back and strategize each attack. I mean, of course, if you upgrade your armor enough in The Witcher, it becomes to a point where you're just button mashing, killing everything that's in your way. But the point is that, it's not. While the combat is difficult, especially or not necessarily difficult, but it is rewarding and yet simple, especially when you're fighting a big monster. It's not as tactical as I would like it to be, but that's just personal preference.
No, I would agree. Well, maybe not exactly what you're saying. I don't think that the combat system was bad, but I think that the monster design, well, the monsters were praised for being fairly well designed, and what's the word I'm looking for? They were intuitive, or not intuitive, but they would act on their own. I do think that more monsters that had a bit more puzzles to them, like maybe you you came across a guardian, and the guardian has a laser shield, and now you have to figure out how to deal with the laser shield. Little stuff like that just adds an additional layer to complexity for more higher level players.
Right. When you see a guardian with a shield, it's just like you just. Well, in the game, when you see it with the shield, you just kind of knock it out of the way, and you're like, keep going on with your business.
Yeah.
At least, yeah. So that I agree with you.
And then
I was severely disappointed with the Leviathan quest. You know what I'm talking about?
No, go on.
There are 3 hidden Leviathans in the map, and they're these the huge skeleton creatures, and it's so cool to find them out there. But I wanted something to happen with them. The only thing I could find was that these guys tell you if you can take a picture of them, we'll give you some rupees, but that doesn't. Or they give you something, I don't remember, but it's not great. I would have been happy to find some interesting or like that'd be cool, skeleton armor from like each of the Leviathans. Like that would have been cool, but it was just kind of a letdown.
All right, so on a last note, a good action adventure game is a game that allows freedom of agency. It has semi-open worlds, or at least a world that is
Feels open.
feels open, or it has multiple choices. We want combat should be puzzles within itself, and usually a good combat system like The Witcher or Dark Souls, but maybe not to that level, which adds to the puzzle, is much appreciated. And players want to be rewarded for exploration. Is that all right?
I'd say that's pretty good.
Aye, Captain.
All right. So, thanks for watching our pilot episode then. Hopefully we can make more of these.
We're listening.
Yep.